Odessa, winter 1873. In a basement, a midwife drops her lantern. The flame dies, but darkness cannot mute the sound. Two newborn cries rise together, identical. The women there meet with the recognition of witnesses who cannot name what they saw. The mother lies broken, her skin a map of chains and plantation sun. She holds two daughters whose faces are white as frost and foreign to this city. Odessa is not merely a port, it is a machine, a forgetting built on trade and quiet agreements. Men in wool coats count grain and keep silence. Priests maintain ritual to enforce order. Sailors carry superstitions because the sea punishes the careless. In such a place difference is dangerous and rumor becomes law. When the midwife carries this night like a coal from mouth to ear, the story grows teeth. Long before it reaches the harbor, the city will believe anything that preserves its peace but not the truth that undermines its hold. A priest refuses baptism. The ledger stays blank. A parish book saves space where names should be. The small absence is the first instrument of erasure. It is deliberate and moralized. The community prefers erasure to reconciliation because acknowledgement demands consequence. Listen carefully, for I will show you how institutions collude to bury what unsettles them. A physician arrives curious and clinical. He notes that the girls react to each other as if bridged by something unseen. A tap to one leg moves the other. A light in one eye contracts both pupils. A stethoscope discovers layered rhythms, two heartbeats felt as echo inside a single chest. He writes, then discovers pages removed from his journal as if the truth had been edited out. The convent offers promises of protection that require silence. Merchants sell provisions but spit prayers when they pass. The priesthood frames the girls as omen and the city accepts containment as peace. These are not grand conspiracies, only repeated choices, small enough to be believable and large enough to erase a life over time. This opening is not sensational, it is a lesson in power. Forgetting is a practice taught through routine. The twins are born into a system that will not see them. That refusal will define them. Keep the image of two pale faces in a dim room, the mother clutching them like both accusation and shield, and understand that what follows is a descent into institutional concealment and the slow machinery of a society that chooses silence over truth. Remember this moment, it will harden your judgment forever. Listen now and feel how secrecy grows teeth in the quiet corners of a city that needs itself intact more than it needs mercy. She hid them tighter after the market closed, after the candles guttered, after the priest refused to touch their foreheads with water. Curtains stayed drawn even at noon. Lamps burned only in the smallest rooms. Lessons were taught in whispers. Move without sound. Do not call attention to yourself. Speak only when silence allows it. The mother became a map of restraint. Every step measured, every noise a risk, and the two girls learned the world by the margins of light they were allowed to see. Then a man came who did not speak in scripture or rumor but in instruments and small neat observations. Dr. Anton Kayevich arrived like a thin blade of reason cutting through superstition. He wore a coat pressed and clean and his hands sought facts rather than accusations. He bent toward the children with the clinical patience of a man who believed the world could be named and thus managed. What he found unsettled the ledger of his certainties. The girls reacted to each other as if they shared a hidden line. A touch to one leg made the other answer. A light in one eye tightened both pupils. A stethoscope pressed to a chest returned not one steady drum but an echo, a rhythm layered and folded as if two hearts had learned to live inside the same measure. He wrote methodically and then discovered pages gone as if his notes had been censored by history itself. He felt the theft as a pressure on his throat, and then the city felt it too, because Odessa does not like the unknown to be left unpunished. The bells rang that Sunday without a hand to pull them, and the sound was not tidy, it was accusation. It shook rafters and unlatched conversations. The town looked up and saw the mother with her daughters on the frozen road, and the noise rose with them as if the very architecture of faith had been offended. The priests met in shadow, not to heal but to contain. Their decision read clear in the way men moved that night like wolves circling a wound. They would take the children from the mother, not to save them but to erase the proof of an act the wealthy could not admit. You must understand this moment as a lesson in how communities choose peace over justice, how ritual becomes a tool of removal, how the same hands that bless can also bind and bury. The women were dragged through alleys toward a convent older than law, and there under stone and candle the city performed its remedy. It called it exorcism, but the room shook not with demon but with fear. Witnesses remember fragments. Some said the candles blew out as if wind had come from nowhere. Others swore the girls spoke in a chorus reciting words nobody had taught them. Then the accounts splinter and the truth fractures into rumor. The most brutal line says they were walled up alive beneath the convent, sealed by men who wanted silence and who understood that paper can be burned but a conscience cannot always be convinced to stay dead. When morning came, the mother was gone, her door hung open, the house emptied as if a tide had taken everything with it. The convent denied what had happened, officials smoothed their collars and declared nothing known, and yet the city had committed an act that could not remain private. Calamity followed like consequence, catching up to a debtor. Fires rose, illness ravaged, famine struck, and the people bent toward explanation. They attached the girls as scapegoats, and in doing so they stitched a legend. From their own guilt, the erasure of names did not end the story, it amplified it. You must not mistake suppression for closure. The city thought it had buried what it feared, but what it actually did was open a wound into which memory poured until the wound became the only geography anyone could see. Understand this as the point where private cruelty becomes public law and where a city refines itself by ritualized exclusion. You have seen the removal, now listen to what came after, because the work of erasure is never simple. It is a sequence of small violences repeated until the wound becomes normal and then invisible. The convent kept its doors shut, and the priests spoke of blasphemy aloud in markets to justify what they had done. They whispered that mercy had been offered and refused, and so the city consented to forget in the name of piety. The merchants nodded because scandal would scare away cargo, and the magistrates looked the other way because order cost less than justice. Even doctors who had once recorded anomalies found their notes altered, as if their handwriting itself had been judged and censored. Watch how institutions align to protect hierarchy when a truth threatens property and prestige. The cathedral rewrites doctrine into decree. The courthouse files an anonymous complaint about public disturbance. The merchant guild circulates a private notice about uneasy trade routes. All of these actions read like accidents until you map them together and see the pattern: a coordinated silence with many hands that never meet in the light, yet serve the same purpose: to bury an inconvenient mirror so the city can continue to admire itself unchallenged. Now consider the psychology of a population taught to fear difference. Every household learns new rituals. Cross yourself 3 times, avoid the pale house at dusk, do not look children in the face, teach them to avert their eyes. A custom becomes law because everyone obeys it, and obedience reinforces the fear that made the custom necessary in the first place. This is how cultural control becomes self-sustaining. The story of the sisters is taught as lesson rather than record. It becomes the folklore that disciplines the young and protects the powerful, because confronting the origin of the tale would demand structural change, and no elite wants that. Think about the mother who vanished. In the moral calculus of survival she performed. Each step she took toward protection was judged as sin. Each bargain she sought with the rich was read as betrayal of order. She tried to buy silence, she tried to bribe sanctuary, she tried to flee across the harbor, but the city's gaze was a net that closed whenever she made a move. Understand the cruelty in that net. It is not only violent, it is surgical. It removes support systems, leaves a nursing woman to hunger, and then blames her for the decay around her. This is how blame migrates from perpetrator to victim and becomes the accepted story. Hold this observation, because your next lesson is about rumor as a weapon. Rumors do not merely travel, they are engineered by those who benefit from them. They sharpen into accusations at the moment they become useful to power, and dissolve when those in power need plausible deniability. The sisters were transformed into omen, then into threat, then into public justification for punitive measures. You will see this again in every society that protects itself by rewriting its sins into specters. Learn it now and you will see how histories are altered to hide more than people, they hide responsibility. Now listen as I pull back the curtain on the machinery that turned sorrow into statute, on the quiet architecture of erasure that stitched itself into Odessa's daily life. You have seen removal, now see the system that made removal sensible. See how merchants, priests, magistrates and neighbors became cogs in a machine whose only design was to protect property and prestige at any human cost. Power does not always shout, it whispers into ledgers and into the ear of a clerk. It recommends omission and the clerk obliges. It pressures a physician to tidy his notes and the physician obliges, because reputation and bread are fragile things. Observe how language is weaponized, how the word omen becomes legal justification, how the term unclean morphs into administrative policy, how ritual gestures of piety are repurposed into instruments of exclusion, every sign of faith folded into the scaffolding of containment. Consider the court notices that never reached public record, petitions filed with anonymous signatures, a magistrate who inexplicably falls ill the week he would have objected, a merchant whose warehouse goes up in flames the night after his sympathy was suspected. These are not coincidences, they are patterns, a choreography of silence executed by hands that will never be named in a scroll or sermon. And then there is the softer violence, the social choreography that trains a populace to police itself, 100 small humiliations administered until the vulnerable learn to hide, as if secrecy were a virtue, not a remedy. Watch how children are taught to avert their eyes, how mothers cross themselves 3 times when a pale face passes, how jokes turn into threats, how appetite for rumor hardens into appetite for purge. The community becomes both judge and executioner without a single public decree. This is how institutional manipulation migrates from elites into neighborhoods, from pulpit into hearth, from ledger into gossip, and once it migrates it is unstoppable because everyone now has a stake in its survival. You must also see how knowledge is corralled, how those with instruments of truth are invited into quiet rooms and asked to sign non-disclosure with the soft coercion of social death. The doctor who kept a journal watches pages vanish and understands a choice is imposed upon him: speak and be ruined, or be silent and live with the knowledge that you betrayed a life. Understand the moral calculus at work, the trade-off presented as compassion: give up the troublesome truth to save the city, the same logic that justifies expulsions, burned pages and sealed basements, a calculus that always values order over people because bodies are replaceable but systems are not meant to be questioned. This institutional logic did not die with that winter, it mutated, it traveled with merchants and clerics, it became precedent in other towns where inconvenient lives must be contained for the comfort of the majority. Hold that pattern in your mind, because now we will travel into the aftermath where absence becomes presence and history itself begins to haunt those who tried to bury it. The descent grows colder and the revelation sharper. You are being taught to see how societies choose which lives matter and which may be erased without consequence. Now watch how the city converts absence into accusation and how paper becomes the battlefield for truth. You saw the removal, you saw the convent, the mother driven to silence. Now see the aftermath where erasure mutates into legend and legend becomes leverage for control. Records do not vanish by accident, they are excised with intention. A clerk instructed to misfile a page, a ledger scorched along the margin, a baptism line rubbed until only ghost letters remain. These small acts stack until whole lives are rendered invisible, and that invisibility is then sold as stability to frightened citizens. Consider Anton Kievich's journal as a case study of institutional pressure. He began with clinical curiosity, careful observations recorded in neat script, then found his pages torn as if an unseen editor judged that truth must be redacted. He locked what remained away, yet the act of locking is also an admission that what you know threatens the order you serve. The physician who keeps secrets to survive becomes complicit in the very erasure he once objected to. Watch how commerce participates. The merchant who once traded openly now refuses a woman at his stall because reputational risk is currency. He whispers to other traders and the whisper becomes policy. No public decree is needed when markets enforce silence through social death. A dockhand who reported seeing the girls is denied work. The sailor who wrote of pale figures finds his name missing from ship logs. The economy polices memory as efficiently as any magistrate. Notice the rituals that follow. Crosses salted on thresholds to ward off perceived contagion. Children taught to avert their eyes. 3 signs of the cross muttered whenever the twin shadows pass. These rituals are not superstition alone, they are the social architecture of exclusion built to last because they require no committee, only repetition and fear. Turn your attention to the city's architecture. The convent, the cathedral, the narrow alleys become instruments of forgetting. They are places where decisions are made out of public view and where the language of piety masks administrative choices. A sealed basement in a religious house reads like civic policy when priests claim ignorance and magistrates look away. The religious vocabulary reframes violence as mercy, and in that reframing the perpetrators become the custodians of order. Finally, understand the moral economy at play. Those who suppress another life justify it as protection for the many. They tell themselves that hiding the twins spared the city chaos, when in truth it transferred chaos into a subterranean form. It returned as plague, as famine, as fire, as whispers that corrode trust. Memory becomes a contagion not because it is true but because it unsettles the comfortable arrangements that privilege requires. Hold this as a lesson in how institutions choose victims and name them monsters. The next step will show you how absence itself begins to haunt the living and how the suppressed will find a voice that no ledger can erase. Now watch how history fights back in tiny rebellions of ink and paper, and how the truth, no matter how carefully buried, insists on scratching at the seams. Decades pass and the city smooths its face, but a clerk with salt in his beard finds a half-burned ledger in a damp corner of the archive, and something in him does not look away. He holds the page to the light and sees faint scores where names once were erased like scars on paper, and the sight pricks a conscience that had been trained to sleep. A physician's false panel yields a box of notes curled with age, and behind those torn pages the script of Anton Kayevich breathes again, clinical observations half destroyed but precise enough to force a new question into the room. 2 heartbeats felt in one chest, reflexes mirrored across bodies, instruments resisting as if air had become matter, and in the margins a note that breaks off mid-sentence as if someone had struck his pen with a fist. The fragment reads, "If they are allowed to grow, Odessa will," and then the line is ripped clean away like a throat being cut. Of course officials scoff, they call it unstable handwriting, poor preservation, or the overactive imagination of a lonely doctor, and yet the fragments sit there like nails under the skin of the city, uncomfortable and stubborn. Understand how those fragments operate as a new kind of power. They do not overthrow the established voice, but they complicate it. They make priests shift in their collars and merchants lower their voices at tavern tables. A document cannot shout like a bell, but it can erode complacency. Palimpsests of denial gather in backrooms, and the more pieces men find, the more they must decide whether to admit an ugly truth or to double down on silence, and in those decisions your real lesson lies. Notice the way rumor leans on these scraps to become spectacle. Sailors write of pale women seen at dawn. The merchant's ledger records boat logs that stop mid-entry. The boy who peered at the convent wall insists the shadow moved as if in recognition, and a dozen small testimonies converge not into proof as lawyers would demand, but into a moral pressure that shifts neighborhoods into superstition and policy alike. The city tries procedural fixes, it burns orphan pages, it replaces ledgers, it sanctions clerks who ask too many questions, but the reaction is itself a confession of fear, because institutions do not panic unless something outside the order threatens to expose the soft underbelly of power. The more the archives are cleansed, the more the streets hum with sightings. Children dare one another to press their ears to rotting doors, and older men find themselves waking with memories of creaking floorboards and voices that chant in unison. This awakening is not supernatural alone, it is social. It is the way conscience manifests when ledger lines no longer hold sway, and the city must contend with the fact that forgetting is not a passive state but an active labor, and those who perform that labor can be named and held accountable if witnesses will risk it. The fragments change the map of obligation. They force a decision upon the living to either make reparation or double down upon erasure, and that decision will be the hinge upon which the rest of this descent swings. Keep that hinge in your mind, because the next revelation will show how memory, once stirred, does not merely haunt, it organizes, and it recruits those willing to listen into a pattern far deadlier to the order than any exorcism could ever be. Now understand the real apparatus behind the spectacle, the invisible council that turned rumor into policy and used fear as a governance tool. They called themselves no name in public, but in private taverns and back rooms they had a shorthand. Only they understood: the ledger men, the clerics, the merchants, the magistrates, a network welded by mutual interest and the same willingness to erase trouble at a stroke. Think of them as a sin society, not of ritual and robes but of arrangement and consent, a civic cartel whose job was to keep commerce flowing and reputations intact at any human cost. They met over stamped ledgers and poured brandy while they planned omission. They drafted the language that would later become doctrine, and they taught priests how to preach it in ways that bent conscience into compliance. Observe the mechanism. First they manufacture doubt by scattering fragments, a half-remembered bell toll here, an odd illness there. They nudge testimony through favored mouths, and they reward conformity with credit and contracts. The merchant who whispered the right story received better cargo space, and the dockhand who kept silent kept his berth. The reward and the threat moved like two poles of the same magnet, pulling the city into alignment. Notice how they weaponize ritual. The cross becomes a boundary not of faith but of exclusion. The threefold sign over thresholds is taught as piety and enforced as policy. Children learn to avert their gaze, and obedience becomes internalized. The result is not only compliance but a moral language that justifies exclusion as protection. When everyone speaks in that language, the machinery of erasure looks like common sense, and the operators become invisible because their acts read as tradition rather than design. Then there is the small bureaucratic work that does the heavy lifting: misfiled baptismal entries, scorched pages, catalogs rewritten by hands that never meet in daylight but always achieve the same outcome: the disappearance of a name. These are administrative murders, paper cuts that never show in coroner's reports because their effect is to make a life cease to exist in record and therefore cease to exist in law. You must see the psychological architecture behind this too. The sin society did not only act outwardly, it reprogrammed memory. It trained neighbors to police each other, to prefer the comfort of forgetting over the discomfort of acknowledgement. That is the most dangerous power of all, because it turns the population into its own jailer, and the guards wear everyday clothes and pray in the same chapel as the vulnerable. Take this as a hard lesson: it is easier to erase children from paper than to remake a city to repair injustice. The Sin Society understood that repair demands resources, accountability, and a willingness to alter advantage, and they had none of those inclinations. They chose instead the cheap efficiency of silence, and in doing so they taught the city to believe that some lives are disposable. Learn to read the ledger, not for numbers but for decisions, because every absence in ink is evidence of moral choice, and every moral choice shapes the world you will inherit or resist. Now watch how the story shifts from local terror to slow contagion as memory leaks into movement and the erased force returns as pattern. When officials tidy archives they imagine order restored, yet the city's rhythm betrays them. The docks keep time with a heartbeat no ledger can contain, and sailors who laugh at noon tremble at dusk, because the twins teach memory like a transmission, not a tale. Partial sightings accumulate like evidence. A merchant reports 2 pale women at dawn. A fisherman writes in a trembling hand that the sea answered with a storm, and a child who dared to press his ear to an old convent wall swears he heard lullabies threaded with names he never learned but felt as if they had always been his own. These slips are not random, they are the edges of a field where repression meets resonance, where the effort to excise a life leaves a frequency in the gaps, and that frequency organizes itself into pattern through the weak points of a culture. Markets, prayers, ships, playgrounds, places where people remain porous to one another and to the past. Understand the sociology here. The city taught itself to look away, and in so doing became more susceptible to the thing it refused to face, because denial is not absence, it is an energy, and energies have direction. They attract witness and they recruit attention like iron draws a compass needle. Slowly the pattern recruits those who already carry guilt or curiosity. A sailor who once struck a slave now hears voices that replay his cruelty to him at night. A magistrate who signed a paper of omission dreams of the ledger scratching back at his hand. These are not mere hauntings, they are moral feedback loops forcing inward attention where outward projection once sufficed. And notice how art and commerce absorb the pattern. 2 ballads shift their lines. Merchants wink at sailors who speak of the sisters as dark superstition, and artists sketch pale faces at the margins of markets. The twins migrate into culture not as monstrous aberrations but as mirrors held up to everyone who trafficked in silence. The city's jokes harden into warnings, the warnings into avoidance, and avoidance into ritualized exclusion that only deepens the field from which the sisters speak. Now consider the practical mechanics of contagion, not mystical but mundane. Copied lullabies taught to children on porches, repeated at night like a shared virus of attention. These repetitions act like echoes, amplifying what the city tried to mute, and the more the echoes carry, the more ordinary men begin to perceive the pattern, until denial becomes impossible without cognitive rupture. This stage is crucial because it shows you how erased truths return not only as ghosts but as social currents that reorganize neighborhoods and consciences alike. The twins did not need to roam every street to change Odessa, they only needed to be remembered in the right places by the right people, and memory spreads faster than ordnance. The lesson here is kinetic memory. It moves, it recruits, and once activated it becomes harder to control than any magistrate's edict. Keep that in mind, because what comes next is the vector of escalation, the point where private guilt turns into public reckoning and the architecture of silence begins to crack under pressure. Now the pattern begins to bloom into confrontation, and what was once whispered in corners starts to echo in halls where power cannot ignore it any longer. By the spring of that year, an archivist named Katerina Holtz made the mistake, or perhaps the decision, of her life. She bound together the scattered fragments of Anton Kayevich's journal with the burned baptismal record and a merchant's private letter, and she called it the ledger of the unspoken. No one told her to do it, she simply reached a limit where silence felt like complicity and compulsion. At once she sent a single copy to the magistrate and another to the cathedral's library, hoping at least one would survive, and what followed proved that truth has its own weather system. The magistrate summoned her at dawn. The letter she had written to accompany the ledger was read aloud, not as testimony but as blasphemy. She was accused of disturbing public order, yet the accusation carried its own infection. Clerks whispered that she had named names, priests found her courage inconvenient but magnetic, sailors carried her story beyond the harbor. By nightfall the city hummed with a question that could not be silenced: what if the twins never died at all? Understand the anatomy of control under stress. The first move is denial, the second is punishment, and the third is ritual. The magistrates ordered a public burning of her compiled pages in the square. Priests framed it as a purification ceremony. The Sin Society watched from balconies, thinking the sight of fire would cauterize curiosity, but they underestimated spectacle's double edge, because when you invite a city to witness destruction, you also invite it to feel what destruction means. Children memorized her words as the pages curled and flamed. Sailors pocketed half-burnt scraps. The crowd fell silent, not from obedience but from recognition, and the silence thickened into something dangerous. A unity born from shared disgust. Institutions can command attendance, but they cannot command conviction. From that day rumors of the sisters transformed again, no longer omens or punishments but witnesses to injustice, each retelling sharpening the city's guilt, every repetition turning denial into confession, because the people began to see themselves in the victims, and that realization is the one thing authority fears more than chaos. Pay attention to the shift. Power depends on belief, and belief once fractured cannot be repaired by decree. You can burn documents but you cannot burn memory. You can silence one voice but not the echo of conscience. That voice awakens. The city understood this too late as walls began to speak and the sea itself seemed to murmur a name that no bureaucrat could erase. Halfway through our descent, I want you to write this phrase in the comments below: truth does not burn. Write it twice to anchor yourself, because what comes next is no longer history, it is initiation. Once you step beyond this point you cannot return unchanged. By midsummer the air over Odessa grew heavier, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Windows stayed shuttered long after sunrise, and those who spoke of the twins did so with lowered voices, not out of superstition but fear of being heard by the wrong ears, because what had begun as myth was now bleeding into politics. The magistrates launched an inquiry not into the truth but into its circulation. They summoned priests, merchants and sailors, demanding to know who still repeated the name of the Pale Sisters and who had read the burned ledger that no longer officially existed. Interrogations multiplied. People vanished. The convent sealed its records again, replacing doors with iron and silence with prayer. Yet the whispers persisted. Servants claimed that inside the cathedral crypt new walls were being built, not to protect relics but to hide what had been unearthed. In secret night work guarded by soldiers, they carried crates marked with symbols unfamiliar to any parish worker, crates that some swore glowed faintly when torches flickered near them. The sea mirrored the unease. Storms came without warning. Fishermen spoke of strange tides that rose against wind patterns, and dockworkers found markings carved into the pier, lines of script in a language no one could name. Sailors said they were not letters but veins stretching from the city into the water, as though Odessa itself were bleeding truth into the sea. Then came the night of the black bells, a storm that arrived with no lightning, only sound, the bells of every church ringing though no ropes moved, no hands touched them. Priests fled into the streets crying that the dead were calling, but others whispered that the bells were not calling the dead, they were warning the living. What followed the next morning chilled even skeptics. 2 sets of footprints found in the cathedral courtyard, perfectly parallel, beginning at the closed gate and ending at the door of the sealed crypt. The prints were small, the size of children, yet deep in the stone as if pressed by great weight. The officials ordered them scrubbed away, but the workers refused. One by one they dropped their brushes, left their pay on the ground and walked into the mist. The magistrates replaced them by decree, yet every dawn the prints reappeared, no matter how thoroughly they were cleaned, and each day the city grew quieter. People stopped singing in markets, stopped whistling at docks. Odessa had entered a silence so complete it felt like punishment. It was then that an old priest named Father Dragan broke the last law of secrecy. He stood before his congregation trembling and said only this: the twins were not born, they were returned. The next day his church was closed, the priest gone, and the sea turned red for 3 mornings straight. Fishermen called it rust, the faithful called it proof, but no one dared to call it coincidence. After Father Dragan's disappearance, Odessa's silence became absolute, the kind that does not fall from fear but from understanding. The truth, unspoken yet known by all. Merchants kept their ledgers locked, priests preached only of obedience, and even the children stopped playing near the harbor, as if instinct itself warned them that sound could summon something listening beneath the waves. Those who dared to speak of the twins did so only in candlelight, behind drawn curtains, whispering that the sisters had crossed from myth into presence. In the deepest part of the city an old apothecary named Yelena claimed to have seen them. She told a scholar who visited from Vienna that one night during a storm 2 figures appeared outside her window, pale against the thunder sky, their faces mirrored perfectly, their eyes dark voids reflecting nothing. Yelena said they spoke without words, filling her head with visions of chains, a mother's scream, and a city turning its back. She fainted and woke to find her house drenched not in rain but in salt water, and the words "sins return" written in the steam of her mirror. She fled Odessa within the week, leaving everything behind. Rumors spread that others had similar encounters. A midwife saw 2 small handprints appear on the inside of her window, though no child had ever touched it. A sailor claimed to hear voices singing beneath the harbor, a lullaby in a language older than any he knew. Some said the twins were not haunting the city, they were judging it, forcing those who profited from silence to feel what their ancestors buried. The wealthy began leaving Odessa quietly by ship, entire families abandoning estates that had stood for generations, leaving furniture, food, even jewelry behind as though they feared taking the past with them. The convent at last reopened its doors, but the nuns were different, pale, expressionless. They spoke little, prayed often, and avoided mirrors. Some said they no longer bled, others that they no longer aged. The Mother Superior denied every accusation, but those who saw her up close whispered that her eyes were mismatched, one light, one dark, like the twins themselves. Late that autumn the fog thickened over Odessa more than ever before. Days passed without sunlight. The city became a ghost of itself. Men returning from sea said the horizon was gone, swallowed by white. Even the church bells lost their sound, their tongues swinging in silence. No one could explain it, yet deep within that fog a story took shape, one that no one dared to write, that the Pale Sisters had returned not to haunt but to claim what had been theirs all along, their city, their memory, their silence. The winter of 1839 sealed Odessa in ice. The harbor froze solid, the ships stranded in place like corpses of wood and iron. The townspeople whispered that it was not nature but retribution for what they had buried beneath the convent. Every night the wind howled through the alleyways, carrying with it faint laughter, the kind that belonged to children but not quite human, not alive either. It was said the sound came from the direction of the sea, where the fog never lifted and where two pale shapes were sometimes seen standing hand in hand. Inside the convent the sisters burned candles day and night, yet the darkness never left the halls. Wax pulled like melted bone across the floors. The younger nuns began to lose sleep. They spoke of hearing small footsteps pacing outside their doors at midnight. Some said they saw shadows under the cracks of their doors, moving like something crawling on all fours. One novice screamed that she saw her own reflection smiling back at her from the basin before the mirror. Even rippled when they told the Mother Superior. She only said they seek what was promised and ordered everyone to pray louder. The city officials tried to reason with the clergy. They wanted answers, they wanted order, but none came. One night the mayor himself entered the convent accompanied by guards. They found the chapel filled with children's drawings carved into the walls, dozens of them depicting two identical girls standing before the sea, their eyes black and their mouths stitched shut by thread. The mayor left before dawn, pale and shaking. He never spoke publicly again. Within a week his family vanished, their house left untouched, as though time itself refused to move inside it. As the days shortened the people began to leave in masses. Carts filled the streets carrying whatever could be taken. The apothecaries closed, the bakeries emptied, the schools locked their doors, and the church bells fell silent once more. Some who remained swore the fog began to move inland, creeping through the cracks of houses, wrapping around windows and doors like a living thing. One sailor swore he saw faces in it, hundreds of them, children's faces, pressing against the glass of his tavern window. Before melting back into vapor he left the next morning, and his ship never returned. By the turn of the year Odessa had become a city of echoes, footsteps without bodies, whispers without mouths. The few who remained learned to live without mirrors and without light, for even a candle's flicker seemed to summon something they could not name. The Pale Sisters had become more than myth, now they were memory breathing and inescapable. When the spring thaw finally came, it brought with it the stench of rot from beneath the cobblestones. The river swelled black with thawed soil and something else, something the fishermen refused to name. They pulled their nets in silence, their faces pale. The catch was wrong, twisted things, bloated things, not fish but shapes with tiny hands, webbed and white and cold as marble. The magistrate ordered the waters sealed, no boats, no washing, no baptisms. The river was now forbidden, yet at night it still whispered like a throat trying to speak through water. In the cathedral basement, records from the last decade were found, charred, half burned by someone who wanted them gone. The surviving pages described two infants taken from a woman found unconscious in a brothel near the harbor. The date was March 17, 1873. The mother unnamed, the children marked simply as reclaimed by order of the diocese. No explanation followed, only an addendum written in the margin by a trembling hand. It read, "Not of flesh as ours are." Meanwhile survivors of the convent began to wander the outskirts of Odessa in rags. They did not speak, their eyes hollow. They carried pieces of parchment folded in their palms as if afraid to let go. Those who tried to read them fell into seizures, their mouths bleeding. Priests called it hysteria, physicians called it infection. Neither stayed in the city long enough to test their theories. By midsummer the convent itself was swallowed by the riverbank. It sank into the mud like a body exhaled by the earth, and in its place grew reeds the height of men. Children playing near the water reported seeing faces beneath the surface, faces that moved when no wind blew. One child said they smiled at her, another said they sang her name. None of them went near again, but their drawings began to appear across the city, on walls, on carts, on the doors of homes, faces of two identical girls, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling. One evening a traveler from Vienna stayed in the inn near the river. He left before dawn, scribbling one final note in the guest ledger. They came to me in the fog. They asked if I remembered them. I lied. That spring was known as the season of the twins. Every birth that year in Odessa produced stillborns. Every clock tower stopped at the same hour and the bells rang on their own. The city began to understand that whatever was buried beneath its streets was no longer content with silence. It wanted witnesses. By autumn, Odessa had turned gray, not from fog or storm but from something heavier, something that settled into the walls and lungs alike. People spoke slower, walked quieter, even the dogs stopped barking. The markets emptied. The priests left one by one, leaving behind locked churches and unlit candles. At the heart of the city, the old orphanage that once belonged to the Sisters of Mercy reopened without announcement. No one saw who unlocked its doors, but inside the air carried the same perfume, the same faint lullaby that once lulled the nuns into their final sleep. A few who dared enter reported a sound like breathing under the floorboards. They said the portraits on the walls seemed new, as if freshly painted. Though the orphanage had been abandoned for decades, each portrait bore the same two faces: pale girls in black dresses, their eyes wide, their mouths closed as if holding back laughter. In the moonlight the eyes shimmered with wetness, and one visitor swore he saw their heads tilt together slowly as if to listen. The city archivist, a man named Pavel, attempted to trace the lineage of the Sullivan twins. He followed baptismal records, hospital notes, even graveyard ledgers, but each led to a blank entry, as though the names themselves refused to exist. Finally, deep in the archives, he found a sealed chest marked property of the Ecclesiastical Tribunal, 1874. Inside were 27 photographs, each identical, two girls standing hand in hand, their heads slightly tilted, eyes hollow, and in the bottom corner, written in fading ink, were words in Latin translating roughly to "the sin reborn in symmetry." That night Pavel burned the photographs. He said he felt watched even as he tore the prints to ash, but before the fire could consume them completely, he noticed something impossible. The two figures on one photograph began to fade from the paper, their shapes dissolving like smoke, and when he looked up into the mirror across the room, he saw them standing behind him, reflected but not present. His final words before disappearing were recorded by the caretaker who found his journal: "They are not dead. They are becoming." The orphanage doors now close themselves at dusk, and the windows fog from the inside. Children whisper that if you hum the old convent lullaby while standing outside the gates, two silhouettes will appear behind the curtains, and if you are foolish enough to hum it a second time, they will start humming with you. The officials who later investigated Pavel's disappearance never released their reports publicly, but fragments leaked through whispers and rumor. A constable claimed he found a message scratched into the wooden desk of the archivist's room, written in reversed script, only visible in mirror light. It read, "We are the reflection you denied." Another officer resigned after only one night on the case, muttering that the twins did not haunt the building, they haunted recognition itself. It was as if the moment someone tried to define them, the definition collapsed, taking the mind with it. In the outskirts of Odessa, a physician named Dr. Romanov, who once served the Royal Infirmary, began conducting secret studies on symmetry and human development. His papers described something he called the Sullivan Principle, a hypothesis that perfect biological balance cannot exist without spiritual imbalance. He believed that what appeared as twin births under certain cosmic alignments were not two souls but one consciousness, divided forcibly by divine error, and his notes suggested that the Sullivan twins from Alabama might have been the first proof of this phenomenon. When questioned by a priest, Romanoff claimed he could still hear them, not through dreams but through the rhythmic flickering of candle flames in his lab. He said they spoke in unison, asking him to finish what the doctors in America began, that he could heal the fracture between them if he sacrificed the reflection of one for the freedom of the other. When they stopped speaking, he found his own shadow split into two, one slightly delayed in its movements, the other smiling when he did not. Days later, neighbors heard a scream from his house. They found the physician's body seated before a mirror, two scalpels placed symmetrically beside him. His reflection appeared distorted, though the glass was intact. The coroner reported something unexplainable. The reflection's eyes were open while the doctor's were closed, and the faintest trace of a smile lingered across the mirrored version. Only one page from his journal survived, scorched at the edges. It read, "They do not seek peace, they seek completion, and the world will tremble when they find it." Since then, mirrors have been removed from every room of the old infirmary, and the city quietly forbids their use in public hospitals. Yet in basements and abandoned houses where light barely touches the floor, there are stories that the reflection sometimes appears on its own, whispering the same question that drove Dr. Romanoff mad: which one of you will look away first? Winter swept through Odessa with a silence that felt wrong, not peaceful but waiting. The air itself seemed suspended, as though the city were holding its breath. People began to dream of corridors they had never walked, of children singing softly behind closed doors. Merchants refused to sell mirrors at any price, and priests spoke only in riddles about cleansing rituals lost before the church itself was born. Somewhere beneath the cracked stone streets a sound like distant breathing returned, rhythmic, methodical, alive. A sailor named Mikhail was the first to claim he found the origin. He followed the echoes into the catacombs beneath the abandoned convent, carrying only a lantern and a cross he carved from driftwood. What he found there he never truly described, but his shipmates later recounted that he came back pale, trembling, unable to blink. They said his eyes had mirrored pupils, black upon black, and when he finally spoke he said, "There are two of everything, down there, even the dead." The few who dared to enter afterward told of walls lined with faces, impressions burned into the stone as if generations of souls had pressed their likenesses there to escape the earth itself. And deep in the lowest chamber they found a pool of still water, shaped perfectly round. Even without motion it reflected with unsettling precision, and in its surface flickered two pale forms that never appeared in person. When one threw a stone into the pool, the ripples spread outward, but in the reflection they moved inward toward the center like something feeding. Scholars from Vienna were called in to examine it, but their notes never left Odessa. The surviving assistant whispered before vanishing that the pool was not water at all, but a living mirror, one that remembered the first reflection ever cast and longed to reclaim it. It was said the twin forms belonged to that memory, the echo of a consciousness that refused to die, repeating itself in flesh century after century until balance was restored. Now the catacombs are sealed, filled with concrete, and blessed by every priest left in the region. Yet sometimes on the coldest nights travelers swear they hear humming from below, low and harmonious, like two voices converging in perfect pitch. Odessa sleeps uneasily for fear that one day the song will finish and silence will finally answer back. By early spring Odessa tried to forget the twins. Newspapers printed denials, churches hosted sermons of redemption, and the mayor announced the closing of the convent ruins to the public. Yet beneath the surface unease spread like an unseen infection. People reported glimpsing children in pairs at night near the riverbank, their outlines faint and translucent as if made of fog. Fishermen spoke of reflections in the water that did not match their faces, and of voices calling their names from below. When they looked down they saw nothing but the memory of someone watching back. A former student of Dr. Romanov named Ilya returned from Moscow, determined to prove that what plagued the city was no haunting but a distortion of human perception. He believed the twins represented a cognitive anomaly, a shared delusion that could spread through suggestion alone. He built an apparatus of mirrors and lenses in the attic of his mother's house, a device meant to separate truth from illusion. On the third night of his experiment the neighbors saw his windows flare with blinding light. Then nothing for hours. When the authorities broke in they found the room empty save for the apparatus and a single photograph lying inside the machine. The picture showed Ilya seated calmly between two young girls holding his hands, their faces blurred into one. The photograph was sent to St. Petersburg for analysis, but the train carrying it derailed outside the city, killing every passenger on board. The wreckage burned for 2 days. When investigators sifted through the ashes they recovered one thing intact, the photograph untouched by flame, the edges crisp, the surface smooth, and the faces now clear, perfectly symmetrical, each side identical to the other. Word spread quietly that the twins had transcended form, that they no longer required bodies to exist. They were balance itself, a reflection seeking flesh, a pattern repeating across centuries. The priests claimed they were born wherever symmetry was worshipped and destroyed wherever truth dared to name itself. An echo with will, a mirror that learned to hunger. In a final desperate attempt the authorities ordered every mirror in Odessa to be shattered, but as the glass was broken something strange happened. The reflections did not disappear, they lingered, hovering faintly in the air before fading into nothing, as if departing, not defeated but patient, waiting for the next generation to look into a mirror and recognize them once more. Now the story of the twin sisters exists only in whispers, in forbidden records spoken quietly among archivists who know better than to write their names down. Odessa continues to move forward, but beneath the illusion of normalcy there are small reminders, reflections in windows that move a second too late, children born in pairs with the same mark behind the ear, clock stopping precisely at the same moment in different houses across the city. The hum of symmetry has not vanished, it merely sleeps. Those who study the occult believe the Sullivan twins were not human in the ordinary sense, but vessels for something older, something that predates the line between mirror and soul. They say the first mirror ever made did not show an image, it captured one, and each reflection since then is a rehearsal, a memory of that first taking. The twins, they say, were the culmination of that experiment, flesh molded around an ancient echo that refused to fade. the last remaining priest who participated in sealing the catacombs was found years later sitting before a shattered mirror, his lips sewn shut with rosary thread. The blood had dried into a perfect circle around him. On the wall behind were words scrawled in ashes: "They return when we forget their names." Since then no one in Odessa dares to speak the word twin at night, not even in jest, because the sound itself seems to summon a chill, as though the air remembers what the living tried to erase. And yet there are those who seek them, men who believe the twins hold the key to absolute equilibrium, that whoever understands their nature can command both chaos and order. They travel from city to city, tracing the legend through whispers and ruins, claiming that each reflection hides a doorway to the other side, one where thought and flesh are one and the law of opposites is broken. Those who find that doorway are never seen again. If you have listened this far, you already know the truth. What the doctors tried to hide was never their bodies, it was their design. The twins are not gone, they are watching through every mirrored surface, waiting for someone who dares to look too long. So before you turn off the light, glance once into the glass beside you. If the reflection blinks a moment too late, do not move, for you have already been seen.